So let's go ahead. We're talking about different covenants, right? So we're talking about the covenant with the Gibeonites. This is how we ended yesterday. I want to look at one more covenant that is implicit. It's not an explicit covenant. In fact, the word covenant is not used in the text. However, all of the five criteria we have for a covenant are mentioned. Look at Ruth 1, 16 through 17. Ruth 1, 16 through 17. And talk to the person next to you about where we see our five criteria, right? So covenant parties, obligations, rewards and penalties, strictly binding, and publicly or a covenant sign. Again, Ruth 1, 16 through 17. Again, remember, not all of these have to be as explicit, right? And sometimes other texts can inform where we see these. But for the most part, yeah, these are the five things that need to be there. There's five, but the fifth one is as much as it's possible. It's as much as it's possible. I'll say it like that. So let's start with this question, okay? There's a certain phrase in this section that at least tips me off to, maybe I should look for the covenant elements here. What's the phrase? Okay, that definitely feels covenantal, for sure. But there's a phrase, at least for me, and that might be the one that stands out to you, but there's a certain phrase that's said here that sounds a lot like other covenants we've seen so far. Your people will be my people, and my God, your God, or your God, my God, right? It sounds very similar to I will be your people and you will be my God, you will be my people and I will be your God. Yeah, thank you. Good. Yeah, so of course, God's not the one saying it, so the formula is changed up a little bit, but it's still the same thing we've seen several times, the same kind of language, an alliance with the people, an alliance with God. So then who are the covenant parties? Ruth and Naomi. Good. Ruth and Naomi are the covenant parties. What are the obligations? Or who has the obligations? Ruth. Does Naomi have any obligations? In fact, in verse 18, she just says nothing. She does nothing to join herself to Naomi. If we're using Feisel's categories of unilateral or bilateral, this is a strictly unilateral covenant. Ruth is making a covenant with Naomi, and Naomi has no obligations in the covenant. Ruth is pledging herself, unlike Orpah, to her mother-in-law. Which gets to the same question we have earlier. Do covenants establish relationships, or do covenants formalize relationships? Or do they secure relationships or define relationships, right? They do the second, right? They secure, define, things like that, relationships. They were already in a relationship at this point, right? Because they weren't in a blood relationship. It's mother-in-law, daughter-in-law. But this, Ruth has the ability to leave, just like Orpah. She doesn't, though. In fact, she secures that with a covenant. Good. What are the rewards and penalties? Death. That's right. Death. So if we're going to use Robertson's definition, again, a bond in blood sovereignly administered. This is a bond with death as the consequence. Good. And that gets into the fact that it's strictly binding, right? May the Lord do so to me if anything but death parts me from you. This is like David and Jonathan, who made a covenant before the Lord, right? Not just before each other, but they're calling God into the picture. Which harks to the ideas of marriage too, right? God, when two people get married, they're making a vow to each other, but they're making a vow before God as well, right? And then is it done publicly? It's done as publicly as possible, I'd say. They're in the middle of the road. There's no one else there, right? It's at least done verbally. We can say that. But like I said, not all of these have to be as explicit. But it does seem like in verse 18, the whole covenant formulation is cut short because Naomi doesn't respond as you would expect her to respond, right? Instead, Ruth declares herself covenantally bound to Naomi, and Ruth's going to honor that covenant. Okay. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
When it comes to sovereignly administered,
Yeah.
that means from someone who's higher in rank.
That's right, yeah. It's ironic. It's an exception, yeah. It's an exception because Naomi's in a place where she can't do that because of her discouragement. Yeah, so I think it's ironic and unexpected because one, it's the younger one covenanting with the older one, and two, it's the Moabite covenanting with the Israelite. So it's the Gentile, right? Ruth is full of ironies because the person who has faith that God is going to, Ruth has faith that the only good place to go is where God is. And so she leaves behind her people and her God to covenant herself with Naomi's people and Naomi's God. Because she's full of faith while Naomi isn't. Yeah. 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 Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think these kind of things function differently in the ancient world than they do today. So this gets into why household baptisms and Acts are difficult, right? You get to Acts and you get entire households that were baptized. Like the Philippian jailer, if you believe that salvation will come to you and your household. I think there are some cultures that are more familiar with this today. The idea that joining yourself to certain family members or being part of a certain family means you follow the God and the religion of the leader of the family. So to have a wife or children that have a different religion than their parents was unfathomable. Which is why a missionary strategy for the early church was to convert kings. Because if you convert the king, then all the people in the kingdom are like, okay, I guess we're Christians now. Right? It's just a different way of thinking. We're less individualistic. That's a good observation. Let's talk about another category of covenants. This is covenants and covenant renewals. Covenants and covenant renewals. There's two kinds, and we see both of these in the Bible. We can both create a covenant or what's called cutting a covenant. Where do we get the idea of why is that language used, cutting a covenant? Yeah, because the animals, right? So the formal word that's used is to cut a covenant. So we see the cutting of a covenant several times in Scripture. But we also see covenant renewals in Scripture as well. And most frequently then, covenants do not create relationships, but they secure and structure relationships. So an exception to this would be Joshua 9, right? There was no relationship with the Gibeonites, and it simply created the relationship. But other than that, cutting a covenant formalizes the relationship, and renewing the covenant works to remind the covenant members of the obligations, to create further allegiance to the covenant. Look at Genesis 17:7 as an example. What's said in verse 7 is, I will establish my covenant between me and you. The word that's used here, though, is to confirm. So Dr. Gentry and Wellham, in their Kingdom Through Covenant, do an excellent job explaining this. When was the Abrahamic covenant cut? When was the covenant cut? In chapter 15, right? Not chapter 12, chapter 15, right? And then the covenant's renewed in chapter 17. So look at verse 9. As for you, you shall keep my covenant to you and your offspring throughout all generations. And then verse 21. I will establish my covenant with Isaac, right? So here it's a little bit more clear. God has a covenant that he's not creating with Isaac, but he has a covenant that he's taking and placing on a certain party. He has an existing covenant that he's choosing the members of that covenant. He does that to Abraham. He does that to Isaac. He confirms existing covenants with them. And thinking about the idea that relationship precedes covenant, this helps protect us from thinking that covenant is strictly a contract relationship. Because if relationship precedes covenant, right, and covenant, and especially in God's covenants in the Bible, he chooses who are going to be the members who enter into the existing covenant, then love precedes covenant, doesn't it? In fact, love is a motivation for covenant. Covenant secures love and all of its benefits. That's what covenant does. Covenant doesn't create love. Covenant doesn't create relationship. Covenant secures love. Covenant secures relationship. Then no matter what comes our way, we're bound to each other. And marriage is a great example of that, as was mentioned yesterday. Let's talk next about covenant signs. We're still just laying the groundwork. Covenant signs. Look at Genesis 9, 12 through 17. And God said, "This is the sign of the covenant that I make between me and you and every living creature that is with you for all future generations." What's the sign of the covenant? The bow, right? "I've set my bow in the clouds, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and the earth. When I bring the clouds over the earth, and the bow is seen in the clouds, I will remember my covenant that is between me and you and every living creature and all flesh. And the waters shall never again become a flood to destroy all flesh. When the bow is in the clouds, I will see it and remember the everlasting covenant between God and every living creature of the flesh that is on the earth." God said to Noah, "This is the sign of the covenant that I've established between me and you and all the flesh on the earth." So using the bow as an example, what do covenant signs do? What do they do? Yeah, what do covenant signs do? Yeah, they help us remember, they help covenant members remember the covenant. Good. Now, the interesting thing in Genesis 9 is who is said to look at the bow and remember? God. It's not said that the people will look at the bow and remember the covenant. It says that God looks at the bow and remembers the covenant, right? Again, this is an unusual use of covenant signs in the ancient world. And there was a strict association with the covenant signs and the covenant themselves. And a great example of this is back at Genesis 17, starting in verse 9. "And God said, 'As for you, you shall keep my covenant, you and your offspring after you for all the generations.'" Okay? What is the covenant in verse 10? "This is my covenant, which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring. Every male among you shall be circumcised." Is the covenant circumcision? No. The covenant sign is circumcision, right? "You shall be circumcised in the flesh of your foreskin, and it shall be a sign of the covenant between me and you." The next verse, right? "He that is 8 days old among you shall be circumcised, every male throughout your generation, whether born in your house or bought with your money or from a foreigner who is not your offspring. He who is born in your house, he who is bought with your money shall surely be circumcised. So shall my covenant be in your flesh, an everlasting covenant." Again, there's a strong connection between the covenant sign and the covenant itself. So that in this text, it's a little bit hard to determine, are we talking about the covenant or are we talking about the covenant sign? The sign of the covenant, again, reminds the covenant members of obligations and promises, but circumcision is called both the sign of the covenant and the covenant. Why? Because covenant signs bring assurance of the covenant. Covenant signs bring assurance of the covenant. So then we get to the new covenant. What are the covenant signs that we have in the new covenant? What was that? Well, that's not a physical sign, though, right? So Colossians 1 says that baptism, right? Yeah, baptism and the Lord's Supper, the two sacraments that were given, right? And Jesus says in Matthew, is it 20? When he establishes the Lord's Supper, this is the covenant, right? In my blood. He's calling the sign the covenant in the same way that circumcision is called the covenant here, right? And then Colossians 1 very closely associates the covenant sign of circumcision with the covenant sign of baptism. It's the public demonstration of entrance into the covenant and ongoing relationship in the covenant. So that, like the Noahic covenant, when God looks at the sign, he remembers. When we look at the sign, we remember. We remember our obligations, and we remember God's obligations, so that when we take the Lord's Supper, it gives us endurance, right? It helps us remember God's wrath is not for us. God's mercy and God's grace and God's compassion are for us, right? Yeah.
I know that's the case, but for us,
Yeah.
wouldn't you say for Christians now, looking at the cross is like the sign of the covenant? Because not only
Yeah.
Christians take the baptism, because you don't get baptized every time.
Yeah, it's a one-time thing. But circumcision was also a one-time thing, thank goodness, right? Let's consider next, God is... So then, this is where Presbyterians go wrong, I think, though, right? So I agree with Presbyterians that the sign of the covenant is baptism. I think they're exactly right. I think people who don't say that, I don't know how you can make Colossians 1 work with baptism. Yeah, let's go to Colossians 1. Oh, maybe it's Colossians 2, my bad. If I'm looking for a reference, I can always count on Brian to find it for me.
It's 2:11 and 12.
In him you also were circumcised with a circumcision made without hands by putting off the body of the flesh by the circumcision of Christ. When did that happen? When you were baptized, when you were buried with him in baptism, in which you were raised with him through faith in the powerful working of God who raises him from the dead. But just with our idea of what covenant signs are, covenant initiation, remembering the covenant, things like that, I think it's a natural conclusion also that baptism becomes that sign of the covenant. But where Presbyterians go wrong is they think that the new covenant has unregenerate and regenerate members in it, right? Jeremiah 31 explicitly denies that, and when Hebrews 10 quotes Jeremiah 31. Look at Hebrews 10. Hebrews 8. For the first covenant had been faultless, there had been no occasion for the second. But he finds fault when he says to them, behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah. Not like the covenant I made with their fathers on the day I took them by the hand to bring them out of the land of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, so I showed no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one to his neighbor, and each one to his brother, saying, know the Lord. For they shall all know me, from the greatest of them to the least of them, and I will be merciful to their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. This is true of every covenant member. God has forgiven the sins of every new covenant member. So that to have an unregenerate covenant membership in the new covenant, it brings us back to an old covenant reality the new covenant explicitly promises won't continue. And the priesthood of Christ also, I think, confirms this, because does Jesus intercede for every member of the new covenant or only for some members of the new covenant? Everyone. Is his intercession effective only for some members of the new covenant and not for others? No. The point of his high priesthood is that he has an effective cry for everyone for whom he died and for whom he intercedes. And there's no one that Christ died for, and there's no one that Christ intercedes for who will not inherit salvation, right? So I think you can't be a Calvinist and a Presbyterian at the same time using that argument. Okay, that's a strong statement, of course, because Presbyterians are the best Calvinists we have, and I love my Presbyterian brothers. However, I think it explicitly denies the arguments made in Hebrews. Yeah.
Is there a sense, though, like I'm looking at Leviticus 16, so you shall make atonement for all the people of the assembly.
Right.
That there's a sense that all the Israelites were atoned for.
Yeah.
Does
So
that mean they're all going to heaven?
it is not, because so how do the old covenant sacrifices relate to the sacrifice of Christ? That's a difficult topic. In short, the newness of the new covenant is that the atonement is eternally effective for all of the members of the covenant. Right? So, and Hebrews says that the Day of Atonement, that none of the sacrifices actually took away sins. I would say that they were effective in as much as Christ's death was applied to those people through faith. In that they had faith in God's Messiah, the atonement was effective for them. Yeah. But, however, not all Old Covenant members were regenerate. And I think that's, Jeremiah looks forward to the day when we no longer have to look at the people in the covenant and say, do you know the Lord? And are your sins forgiven? Every person in the covenant has forgiven sins, and every person in the covenant knows the Lord. Because not all Israel is Israel. Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's discontinuity. And we'll talk more about that as we get into descriptions of these covenants. But yeah, it's discontinuity between the Old Covenant and the New Covenant. But I think it's discontinuity that's legitimate because the text tells us that this is a discontinuity. Right? The whole point of the letter to the Hebrews is that the Old Covenant is not as good as the New Covenant. So then if we're to compare Moses and Jesus, what makes Jesus better than Moses? The fact that a higher percentage of covenant members make it to the promised land? Well, if we say 100%, yes. But it's not that like Moses gets like 50% and Jesus gets 75. Every member of the new covenant is led into the promised land by the better Moses, which makes the new covenant better. Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. I think so, yeah. Yeah. Yeah, I definitely, the circumcision made without hands, Paul uses the same phrase in Ephesians 2. Only uses it in the negative, I think. He says that, what does he say in Ephesians 2? It doesn't matter to my argument. He uses the circumcision made with hands, I think is what he says. And in short, I think, and we can talk about more of this when we get to Ephesians, but when we cover our Ephesians class, I think that he's alluding to two things. One, the heart circumcision, and two, he's alluding to the fact that what God called for in the Old Covenant was altars made without hands. And idols were idols made with hands. I think he's alluding to Jewish idolatry of the ceremonial laws, which is what one of his main arguments are here. But I think he's saying what you need is not the idol that's made with hands. What you need is the circumcision made without hands. So every new covenant member has the new covenant heart, I think. Good. Okay, let's talk about God as covenant keeper. Okay, God as covenant keeper. Look at 1 Kings 8:23. I'll just show you two of these references. I have a lot in here, but let's just look at one of them. O Lord, the God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven above or on earth beneath. What makes God different? What makes God different than every other God? Keeping covenant and showing steadfast love to your servants. What's called steadfast love in the ESV? Are there any other translations of steadfast love? Truthfulness, interesting. Yeah. The word is hesed in Hebrew. It means covenant faithfulness. So when you see, great is your steadfast love, or his steadfast love endures forever, it's always in the context of covenant. God's steadfast love is his covenant keepingness. And it's clear here. He keeps covenant and he shows steadfast love. Mercy, yeah, I think the New King James says mercy, which is taken from the Septuagint, right? Which is biblically theologically significant because a lot of times when mercy is referenced in the New Testament, I think steadfast love is what's in mind. I think that Paul means that when he says that we've been raised to life by the mercy of God in Ephesians 2, actually. He's saying that the resurrection from the dead in Ephesians 2 is an expression of God's covenant keeping. God's still the covenant keeping God. But let's look at Exodus, that's exactly right, 34:6. Thank you. The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquities and transgressions and sin, but by no means will clear the guilty, visiting the iniquity of the fathers and their children and their children's children to the third and fourth generation. So when God describes himself, he describes himself in two ways here. He's both ontologically and functionally the covenant-keeping God. And again, this comes from Gentry and Wellham's Kingdom Through Covenant. Ontologically, God is merciful and gracious. It's a statement of who God is. He is merciful and gracious. He is abounding in steadfast love. He is abounding in faithfulness. That's who God is at the core of his being. But there's also functional, right? He keeps steadfast love. God is a God of steadfast love, and that causes him to act in steadfast love. He is a God who by nature is covenantly faithful, and that causes him to act functionally in covenant faithfulness. And what does that look like? Both forgiving iniquity and transgression and sins. The functional reality is a result of God's ontological reality. And that's incredibly important for our security in covenant, right? God doesn't just have a functional quality of keeping covenant. God, by his nature, is covenant keeping. He is faithful. He doesn't act in faithfulness only. He acts in faithfulness because he is faithful. Does that make sense? That gives us such security that God is not fickle in keeping his covenant with us. God is utterly consistent. He's utterly consistent. Psalm 117, of course, is the great psalm extolling God for his steadfast love. For his steadfast love endures forever. For his steadfast love endures forever. For his steadfast love endures forever. Interpreting all of God's acts in history as expressions of his faithfulness and his steadfast love, which endures forever. But if you look at Psalm 117, praise the Lord, all you nations, extol him, all you people. For he is great in hesed towards us. And his faithfulness, his functional, steadfast love endures forever. So because of that, the writer of Psalm 117 calls all of the nations to join him in relationship with God. We can extol God, we can worship God, we can join ourselves to God because he is a God of steadfast love, both functionally and ontologically. Good, let's talk next, unless there's questions about God as covenant keeper, let's talk next about the unity of the covenants. The unity of the covenants. So most of the questions about the covenants have to do with how they relate to one another, right? Are they individual covenants that simply fail and are done away with? Or do they build on one another? Do they function to progress the Bible's story? Do they function to slowly reveal God's covenant purposes and God's covenant plan for the world? I think there's clear unity between these covenants, and we can see that first in the Bible story. We can see that in the Bible story. The story of the Bible, again, we say, is the story of God redeeming people to bring them to himself. They will be my people, and I will be their God. And how does God accomplish that? He accomplishes it consistently through covenants. Consistently, God calls out people that he will be their God, and they will be his people. And he does that consistently through covenants. So there's clear unity there in choosing people, and they will be his people. He will be their God. But more than that, there's linguistic similarities between the different covenants. Consider 2 Samuel 7. What's God's promise to David and his initial promise to David in 2 Samuel 7? 2 Samuel 7:9. I have been with you wherever you went, and have cut off your enemies before you, and I will make you a great name. I will make you a great name. What does that remind us of? Abraham, right? God's God's alluding to or quoting the Abrahamic covenant when he gives the Davidic covenant. Or consider the end of Exodus 2. Why is it that God rescues his people out of Egypt? Verse 24, God heard the groanings and he remembered his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God performs the Exodus as an expression of covenant faithfulness to his covenant promise to Abraham, right? And even think about the new covenant. The new covenant is the day when the heart circumcision comes, which was promised in Deuteronomy 30, right? It's also the day when David will rule from the throne, the Davidic covenant, right? And it's the day when God will write his law on people's hearts, the Mosaic covenant. It's the day when people will inherit the land, the Abrahamic covenant, right? So thematically and in the Bible's story, these covenants function in unity. But think also about the laws given in these covenants, right? What's the law given in Genesis 1? What's the law given? Genesis 1, though, before that. The command that's the blessing. Yeah, subdue the earth, be fruitful and multiply. So then when we get to Noah, he's also told to subdue the earth, be fruitful and multiply. And he's given one other command beyond that. What is it? Don't kill. Which then we see iterated in the covenant given to Moses, right? And in the new covenant, we have the same kinds of moral commands that we had in the Mosaic covenant. So all of these show unity of promise, unity of language, unity of law. There's a unity that drives the Bible's storyline forward between all of these covenants. Does that all make sense? If so, we'll go ahead and take our first break, and then we'll get into the major covenants of the Bible. Any questions about the unity? Initially, right, we'll talk more about that as we keep going. Yeah.
You say covenants are based on love.
Yeah.
So when Christ instituted the new covenant,
Yeah.
it says he loved them till the end.
Yeah.
Is that part of the covenant?
Yeah, I think maybe we could read that covenantally. I'm not opposed to reading that covenantally. And it certainly fits within the theme, right? God has an eternal love for his people, which prompts him to enter into obligations with them that he will fulfill to secure that relationship. But yeah, he loved them till the end. I think that's one of the most beautiful phrases in the Bible, for sure. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's disunity there. Yeah. So even the Westminster Confession of Faith uses the phrase dispensation, actually. The dispensation of works and the dispensation of grace. So I think that before the fall, Adam's righteousness was acquired through his works. And then after the fall, it's acquired still through works, but through the work of Christ. Now we can say that the covenant of works, if there is a covenant of works, right? That's not something I take a bullet for. It's not like I think it provides I think it helps me interpret the Bible in a helpful way, but it's not. I'm not going to defend it like I defend the Trinity by any means. But it provides the opportunity for Jesus to obey God, so to acquire righteousness, right? And that gets into because some people will say, well, no, he obeyed the Mosaic law, and that's how he acquired righteousness. So then that's going to get into we're going to spend a good bit of time this afternoon asking, is the Mosaic covenant a covenant of grace or a covenant of works? And I think that this is where our dispensational brothers misunderstand the Mosaic covenant as a covenant through which people acquired relationship with God. Anyway, yeah, good question. So it's in continuity in the sense that Christ fulfills it as the second Adam. It's disincongruous in that and that it still has redemptive commands or perfecting commands for us today.